with the lecture. And so we have a very special guest today. And so he's a perfect guest speaker for a course like this for several reasons. First and foremost, because he's my friend and co-author on who knows how many papers. And so, but importantly, Brad is started his career at UNCG, right? So for the first few years, he worked as an assistant professor at UNCG. And then he moved on to a really, really great thing. So he was a professor at Georgia Tech and then Texas A&M. And now the department chair still, I assume, at the NC State. Or
2 days removed from department chair. Yes.
Okay, well, it's been quite a few years. So he is probably one of the most published people when it comes to management, international teams, sort of kind of international HROB. And as I said, one of our own. Plus, you did your MBA at UNCG, didn't you?
I did. Yep.
Yeah.
Sure
So that's that experience. Then another thing is that Brad has experience of being the editor of some of the top journals, including Academy of Management, which is arguably #1 in management. And so he's very knowledgeable in that area. And the third reason, and that's specifically when his name came to mind, is that we had that discussion a few days ago about the difference between, or basically where management stops and IB begins. And I could not answer fully that question. So I'm getting some emails here from one of the students. Just 1 second, one of the students is calling me just in case it's a technical issue.
Yeah.
Hello? Should be the same. So we have quite a few people here. Should I send a link to the whole class or, yeah, because I don't, yeah, let me send it one more time. Yeah, I wonder why it would be a different link, but yeah, just a second. So apparently there are several people on a different link, which is strange because I didn't know that we have multiple links for these sessions, but just to be sure, let me just quickly send it to the whole class and then we'll move on because apparently several students are waiting somewhere else.
Well, this is how the new world of Zoom and online education works. That's, I mean, well, it happens all the time.
This shouldn't happen because I don't think we've ever had 2 links. And so all of a sudden, for some reason, we have multiple. So what I'm doing here is I'll just send, so some of you who are in the session already, you'll get a link, ignore it, but those who will be waiting, so I'm adding them here. But anyway, so one of the discussions, Brad, that we had in the lecture before is basically where strategy and management and IB begins. And so I was making the argument that there are some topics that are inherently IB. Like, for example, when you talk about, let's say, expatriation. So it kind of has that international component embedded in it. So I guess it would be, by definition, international HROB. But then others may not be so obvious, like when you talk about some of the theories used in general strategy or general HROB IO psychology. Those are the same theories that are applied in international context, and you don't really need to have international context to use those theories. And so one thing that we would like you to talk about is sort of, how should I explain it? One, what the differences are, but 2, how the 2 worlds kind of coincide. And again, what I mean by that is that I noticed that we, like, for example, when we go to the Academy of Management conference, there are distinct sort of circles. Like there are people who are more like Academy of Management journal people, and then there are people who are more JIPS people. And when there are those receptions at the end of the day, some people go to the receptions of groups that are more general management, but then others go to receptions that are more international. And so you're a unique case where you sort of, commingle in both of those groups. So you obviously hang out with people who are just general, management, like Gilad Chen, for example. But then you also have published extensively in international business journals. And so sort of our crowd, because I don't really know very well the other crowd. So can you talk maybe a little bit about this? I'm not even sure if I'm formulating the question, clearly, but can you show about how this whole thing works, how this whole world of academy works here?
Yeah, I think since my PhD program was definitely OB, so there was not a whole lot of international research or international management stuff going on, but I had that interest coming from an MBA to maybe pursue something from a management perspective, but have an international flavor. And then the other part of it was just wanting to travel and see the world on somebody else's dime. So I was like, yeah, that I could combine my personal desires to travel and see the world and understand different cultures with my scholarly pursuit of thinking more about management. So I that's what happened. So really my grounding, my training is all in mainstream OB. And then I added this cross-cultural component in my dissertation, as Vas said, looking at the issue of culture and how it relates to teams, how people feel about teams, think about teams, multicultural teams, and how cultural values play into teamwork. And so I had the same question, Vas, when I started going to the academy and started kind of, you're always trying to figure out where your home is, right? Where's your academic home? Where are your people that you want to hang out with, associate with, and you find the most in common with? So I struggle with that because I was sort of half in general OB and half in the international management.
That's exactly like your people, right? So you sort of have a circle, and so those circles are not always fully overlapping.
That's true. That's
so
true.
How do you position yourself then? So you said most of us got education in general OB or general strategy because only very, very few universities actually offer a PhD in IB specifically, including this program here. So officially it's business administration. So it's general management. And so some of them will be a little bit more international, but it's still general management, strictly speaking. So how do you position yourself when people ask, what do you do? How do you present yourself? And what advice would you give to our students when they sort of try to position themselves?
I think that was my fundamental question. Am I an OB person doing international management research, or am I an international management person who sometimes does OB research? And I think over the years, sort of in the PhD program and the first few years out, it became apparent that I'm really an OB person. I have a broader set of interests beyond the international sphere. So I do very straightforward vanilla OB leadership research, very straightforward teams research with no international component at all. And then I have that third stream where I kind of bring in the international component. So for me, it felt like in defining myself, it became apparent that, you're doing 75% of your research has nothing to do with culture or international at all. So in a sense, it just became natural for me to kind of define myself more in the OB sphere. And so that's what I did. The other thing I thought, I don't know if you find this, Vas, is that in the international management division of the Academy of Management, back in the day, it felt very macro to me, very foreign direct investment. And I mean, that sort of thing, international mergers and acquisitions. And to me, I was very, very micro. I study individuals, I study teams. And so in terms of finding your people, it was kind of, you kind of felt like a fish out of water in a sense that everybody in this room seems to be doing something at the micro IB level, not the international management, more micro level. I think that also kind of steered me towards more of the OB. In fact, we ended up forming our own group within IM. Martha Mesnevsky, who was at Virginia, Christina Gibson, and I formed our own group of micro scholars within the IB group. We called it ION. I think it still exists. I haven't been in touch with them in a while. International Organizational Network or something. So it was kind of funny that we found each other within the IB sphere and noticed that, there were so few of us, we had to form our own little group in there. So I still thought it was important to really just figure out what you want to do and who you are as a scholar. I mean, if you're 100% international, that's what fascinates you. That's what interests you. That's what motivates you. These jobs are hard enough, and getting rejected is part of the game. So you better really, really love the subjects you're studying because you're going to get a lot of rejection in your career. So again, if that's your passion, I would say follow it. But again, my passion is more about taking a more general approach to looking at individuals and teams in organizations. And then when it's theoretically relevant, bring in the international component to understand how all these things are affected by culture. So again, it's part of, it's your journey is very individualistic, it's very idiosyncratic, and it's kind of just finding your way through. And then when you find something that you feel really passionate about and you find like-minded others that are sort of in that same sphere, then you'll know who you are. You'll know what your academic identity is.
How about job search? Again, one of the questions that came up in one of the previous sessions we had, so which positioning is more advantageous? So for example, somebody observed that general management tends to be associated, or people from top universities tend to do general management. Like for example, when you look at IB schools, most of them would be more like, like St. Louis, Rutgers, SFU, South Carolina, so not your Harvards and business and Stanfords. And so would there be any advantage or disadvantage to have that international flavor to your resume or research stream, or it doesn't really matter?
Yeah, one, I wouldn't worry about it too much because again, I think if you're successful publishing in your area of expertise, the schools will come to you. They'll seek you out, right? So instead of sitting back and saying, okay, I'm gonna be really strategic and try to decide how to frame myself in the hopes that there'll be more jobs in this particular area versus that area. I mean, that's one way to approach it, but I think right now, obviously things are a little in flux, but I think there are plenty of jobs in both the more general management arena and also in the IB. When you look at the jobs boards and listservs from the past, I think there seems to be plenty of opportunity in all those arenas. So I think, again, it goes back to, what's your passion and what drives you? What do you want to know more about from a research perspective? And I think the publishing will follow that because, again, it's all in this field. It is about how smart you are. That's part of it. But more than being intelligent is persistence and perseverance, and your grit in the face of some adversity and also the rejection that comes along with it. So the persistence and perseverance would come more from the passion part, right? It'd come more from, this is what I want to study. This is what I'm focused on. In fact, they tried to talk me out of doing a international dissertation at UNC. And the rationale was, look, that's risky. Collecting data, this was in the 90s. So collecting data you're saying you want to collect data in 5-6 different countries. You're going to go to all these places, do interviews, surveys. You're nuts. Just do a very simple, straightforward domestic dissertation, and then you can do the international stuff later. And I was like, no, this is what I want to do. This is what is driving me. This is what I'm passionate about. So I talked my dissertation advisor into letting me proceed with that. And then she ended up going with me. And we did this data collection all over the world. And it was a blast. So again, it was me sticking to what I really wanted to do and was passionate about, even in the face of people saying, take the easy road, be more strategic, do a simple dissertation, get out, and then you can do all that stuff later. And I just simply refused to do that. Now, the only downside was I was collecting data, my dissertation data in May and June, and analyzing it in July, and graduating July 30th. So that was the downside. Yes, it
so
was.
You managed to finish up your dissertation from data collection to defense in 3 months? Don't say that because our students will relax too much. Don't do it, students. Allocate 2 years, not 3 months.
I don't recommend that. So yeah, we had the proposal. It got defended. It was defended successfully, and then it took another 10 months to find a company that was willing, or actually 2 companies, to let us go to all these locations and do all this research. And then luckily my dissertation chair was a bit of a workaholic. So we just traded drafts every day, multiple times a day for, solid more than a month. So luckily I had someone who was willing to put in the time and the dedication to help wrap it all up there at the end. But again, it sort of goes back to the notion of really doing something that you just feel passionate about. And I loved it because it was really what I wanted to do. So I didn't settle for a more strategic approach. I really went with what my heart, my gut said to do. And so that research stream really became, because the timing was right, I think in the mid to late 90s, people were really hungry for that type of research. And so the journals were very receptive to that. That was my first top tier publication. It was an Academy of Management review. It was the theory portion of that dissertation was published in AMR. So again, that's where I am with that.
Well, again, with 3 months, workaholic, Bill Toller, probably you guys met him, one of our professors. He still says sometimes during the department meetings that Brad Kirkman was able to come for a break between 2 lectures for 20 minutes and still write a few paragraphs of his paper. I know most people cannot do it. Like I need a few hours just to get in the, in the flow before I can write. So maybe that's why. Somebody was asking a question. Did I hear that right?
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about finding those companies to fund that. Can you just say a little bit more about how that worked?
I sure can. So I was able to get funding through UNC. They had a pool of, they had somebody give a generous gift, I guess, to the PhD program, and you had to apply for funding. And that particular idea got funded within the university. So that's one thing. And then on the finding the companies, so at that particular time, you just started to see the arrival of listservs where people were having conversations on the internet. And this was one called, I think, TeamNet. So TeamNet was a very early iteration of a listserv where mostly practitioners, but then academics could have conversations about what's going on with teams. And a lot of these companies were just starting to experiment using teams in different countries around the world, right? They had been using them in the US for a while, and then they started using them elsewhere. And so I just wrote a couple of paragraphs on this listserv about what I was doing, what I was looking for, who I was working with, and would there be any companies out there that would be interested in partnering with us, my team, my dissertation committee, my chair, in trying to answer some of these questions. And I think probably 4 or 5 responded, and then it got down to 3, and then finally I got 2 that said, yeah, let's partner, let's do this. And so, I certainly had a set of questions I needed answered for my dissertation, but I really always treat these engagements like partnerships. Like, well, here's what I want to know. What do you want to know? Like, what are you guys struggling with? And they may tell me 4 things that they're struggling with their teams. And I'm like, oh, okay. I've got some scales, some items that I think will tap into that. Let's figure that out. So it's kind of merging their interests with your interests and really thinking about, I always use the word partnership when it comes to research, right? These are, when you're working with a company, you're partners, and you're partnering up to try to figure out the answer to some stuff. Now, since that was kind of the early days and that was a really hot topic, I think I might have had a little easier time getting that. Now, people, even ourselves included, we're just surveyed all the time. Survey. So you're finding kind of different ways to do it. Qualtrics and Prolific and MTurk, and there seems to be a proliferation of ways to kind of get survey data. But at that time, it was a little bit of luck, I think, and then fortunate to have a program that had internal funding. We were able to fund that as well. So I think that was an advantage because we could go to the companies and say, this is all paid for. I mean, you don't have to pay us a dime. We're taking care of all the travel and all that kind of thing. So, yeah. At
UNCG, at the Bryan School of Business, we actually have a whole department that is presumably managing our relationships with the companies. Joe Erba was in charge, and I think starting yesterday, somebody new will be coming in. But in any case, they do have a lot of connections, at least in North Carolina and the region. So if you're not trying to recruit companies all around the world, you probably will be able to get some connections through them.
And they do have these societies and groups, practitioners. Like I think the one I had good success with when I was doing domestic research was something called the Society for Cross-Functional Teaming or something. And it was local to North Carolina. And I would just go to some of the meetings and introduce myself and talk to people and tell them who I was and ask them, what are you struggling with? And so I think I got 4 or 5 companies, not international, but more so just thinking about teamwork more generally, from professional organizations that I was able to kind of get access to and then just have conversations. And if people are interested, great. If they're not, that's fine too. I'm just, here's some stuff that we're working on. And I've hired a person that ran HR for Burt's Bees before it was bought by Clorox. She works for me as a professor of practice here at NC State. And she said something like, after she'd been here a few years, she's like, man, if I'd have known that you guys were here as researchers doing all this cool stuff, I would have brought you guys in like every year to do something. And I'm like, so we have a problem. We do. Like we don't connect very well. I mean, she's sitting there at Burt's Bees saying, if I knew you were here doing all this great stuff, we would have been collaborating for years. And I was like, yeah, we have a problem. We don't do a very good job of selling ourselves and letting people know who we are and what we do, what we can offer. I always joke that McKinsey will charge you $500,000 to do the same thing we can do, and their measures they're using won't even be reliable. They don't even care about scale reliability and validity. So what they come up with is probably not that great. And the only problem I've ever had with that is a company said, well, if you're not going to charge me anything, how could it be any good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, I can charge you.
I can charge you.
Well, yeah. You want to give me $100K to make yourself feel better about what I'm offering, then we're good.
You know, the joke told on Car Talk, you know, a man brings his car to a car repair shop and something's making a rattling sound out of the hood. The mechanic opens the hood, does something there for 30 seconds, says, start the engine. The guy starts the engine. Sure enough, the rattling sound is gone. So the mechanic says, well, it'd be $200. And the guy says, wait a second, you were there for 30 seconds and you're charging $200. And the mechanic says, oh, I'm sorry, sir, let me start over. How long do you want me to work on it this time? Yeah, so another question, one comment, but then question. So one comment, if you've seen the 2019 Journal Impact Factor data released just a couple of days ago, now JIBS is basically number one. So the Academy of Management Annals is number one, and then, you know, like those annual things. But then now JIBS has a higher impact factor than AMJ, AMR. So surprisingly, so I guess that sort of tells you something about the IB field. We'll see how long it's going to be there. But anyway, Brad, another question. So for many years, you've been the department chair. So not only you're a very, you know, successful researcher as far as your publications go and the influence in the field, but also you've been the person who makes the hiring decisions and, you know, managing. So any advice you would give to the students now, many of them, in fact, most of them actually do have teaching jobs. So the way the program is structured is that most of our students come to us as instructors, and they just, you know, have a lot of experience, but never had a chance to do the PhD, and now they're doing it. But soon enough, they will be applying for jobs probably at different institutions or for promotion. As a department chair, what do you look for in you or in people you hire and promote? But also, what advice would you give to the people who are just starting that academic career? So how can they strategically approach it so that they have a successful academic career in tenure track positions?
Yeah, I was just thinking this question sounds very familiar. And then I thought, oh yeah, I've done this talk at Academy. Probably 2 or 3 years in a row, I had the doctoral students who are on the market, maybe 50 or 60 of them in the OB division. And I have a set of slides I'll send to you, Vas, that you can share.
That would be nice, yeah.
With the group. They're very self-explanatory. The bullet points are pretty detailed. So it kind of walks you through, I think it's called Finding the Right Job or something like that, and gives tips for all the things that you would try to figure out as you're doing this. But, you know, a couple of things. One is, you know, try to figure out what they're looking for. Like, is it a group that's trying to add more of the same thing to their repertoire of what the group does? Or is the group looking for something complementary to what they do? So are you being brought in because you're unique and you're complementing something the group doesn't have, which you should play that up? Or are you being brought in because you're adding more supplementary fit, right? You're just doing more. The group wants to grow its reputation in a certain area. The other thing that I recommend when you're on the market, when physical face-to-face interviews, but also Zooms, I guess, when you're interviewing, definitely know something about the research with everybody you meet. Because I've been in situations where it's clear to me in the first 2 minutes, the person I'm talking to has no idea what I do and no idea what my research stream is, and can't ask me anything about it, right? So what really impresses me is when someone says, hey, I saw your article in 2018 in AMJ where you talked about this. How did you come up with that idea? And do you have any plans to extend that research out? Because I've actually got some data that, you know, when you can sit with people and they can tell that you've done your homework and that you've shown an interest in them and you've read up on their research and you can ask intelligent questions, I think that's important. Clearly, you want to demonstrate proficiency in research and also teaching, but also just being a good colleague. People, you know, we certainly feel like we at NC State in our group, we try to hire people who are really smart, very productive, but that are also fun people to work with, interesting, engaging, nice people, because, you know, you're making sometimes lifetime decisions when you hire people, particularly if you bring them in with tenure. These are could be long-term jobs. And so there's the research part, the teaching part, and then there's also the colleagueship part, which is kind of demonstrating how you can fit in that. The only other thing I would say, and again, I'll send you the slides, Vas, after today, is I always say your job talk is not yours. It's the audience's. And so I saw someone come into A&M when I was at Texas A&M, and he was about halfway through his job talk, and people were asking a lot of questions, which is a good sign. That means that they're engaged, and it stimulated a lot of thinking. But you could tell he was getting frustrated, and he finally just stopped the group and said, look, if you guys don't stop asking so many questions, I'm not going to make it through all my slides. And this was like a job talk in the morning, like about 10 a.m. And I was like, oh, you're toast. I mean, like, you're not getting a job here. And yet you have interviews the entire rest of the day. There's a reception at somebody's house tonight. Somebody's taking you to dinner later. And I'm like, all that is now wasted because you told us that the job talk is about you. You have to get through your slides, right? And it's like, nope, job talk is not yours. The job talk belongs to the room. Let them kind of take you where they want to go. So again, I think those are the ones that are top of mind, but I'll follow up with more.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation. Yeah. Another question that comes up all the time, how do we publish in top journals? And with your experience as an editor or as an author as well, I understand that it's, not something that can be explained in 5 minutes, but any tips or tricks or, quick advice, shortcuts that students can take if they're aiming to publish in AMJ quality journals?
Well, the first thing is know that we all get rejected. Yesterday, I got a rejection letter from AMJ. It never gets any better. Never gets any easier. It still hurts to get rejected. So
even with your editorship experience, you still treat it as as immortal.
Yeah, I mean, and the more you talk about that, and you talk to people in the field, like I remember my heroes, the giants that I looked up to, said, "Oh yeah, I get rejected all the time." I was just assuming that these prolific scholars never got rejected. I just thought they would, because they know exactly what they're doing, how to write, how to publish, so they don't get rejected. And that's not true. I remember when I was an associate editor, I had to reject like 2 or 3 people that were like superstars in the field, like all in one week. I had to reject them. And that's when I also learned that, it's not a matter of who you are or your stature in the field. It's all about the quality of your ideas. And I think also journals are a bit different from one another in terms of what they're looking for and the bent they take on something, and even the way sometimes the papers or articles are structured. So I tended to focus more so on AMJ, AMR, and to some extent JP, because they all sort of have a similar flavor to them. Because I mean, there are people who publish in every journal in our field, and I think that's amazing. But for me, it was more about focusing my energy and effort on a smaller subset of journals that were kind of similar in what the type of work they were looking for. The same thing was true with reviewing for journals. I tended to focus on you get invited to review all the time, but I decided to focus, and I focused primarily on AMJ as the #1 journal I wanted to review for. And that led to me being added pretty early on in my career to the editorial board. And then that also led to me being named an associate editor pretty early in my career as well, because I tended to narrow my focus and put my energy in a smaller subset. And that helped me not only from a writing standpoint and a publishing standpoint, but also from the editing standpoint, because it really sort of helped me kind of focus my energy and attention rather than being spread too thinly across a wide array of journals. I do recommend that, to the extent that you can, going to the publishing workshops that are at the national meetings, international meetings. There's always a Meet the Editors panel. There's always, and I did a million of these, how to publish in AMJ, tips for publishing in AMJ. So a lot of advice from productive scholars. I think those are helpful. I don't think there's a magic formula. I don't think if people are waiting saying, if I could just get the formula, the 5-step plan to publishing in AMJ, then I'll know exactly what to do. There isn't one really. There's not a secret formula that some people know and some don't. I think it's a matter of, again, your own journey and finding out who you are and your strengths, and then sort of tailoring that in a way that produces some research. So again, there's there's no secret sauce, but there are things that you can learn along the way that increase your chances of publishing success, right? There's no magic bullet secret formula, but again, you do see some common mistakes as an associate editor and a reviewer that are sometimes very easy to fix. It's like, wow, they should have known better than that, or this or that. So most of that stuff you can pretty much figure out. So I would advise you to seek out those sessions on publishing and identify 2 or 3 or 4 journals that you really feel like could be your home, and focus on those. And there's plenty of advice out there for how to increase your chances. But again, I have more rejections from AMJ than I have acceptances. So that's just the way it is, right? Not every idea is going to make it into AMJ.
Good advice. All right, so we don't want to take too much of your time. So I see students had some questions in the comments. If anyone wants to ask them, now is the time before we move on with the lecture. There was one about consulting on the side. Are you doing any consulting on the side? Does it help? Is it for money, or is it for connections? Or any comments on consulting on the side?
Yeah, so there are 2 different versions of the money on the side for business schools. One is executive education, or we call it exec ed, and the other is consulting. What I found as an active researcher, I liked exec ed better because you go in, it's a finite amount of time, you deliver content to executives in a particular company or multiple companies, and that's the extent of the engagement, right? Then you're out. Then you're back in your office working on research. Consulting really can consume a lot of your time. These are longer term engagements. They involve you collecting, analyzing data, presenting. So to me, I always resisted the consulting route because I felt like it would just kind of suck up a little bit too much time away from my research. And so the extra money is great on consulting or exec ed. I mean, it can be very lucrative, but for me, consulting just didn't fit kind of what I wanted to do in my portfolio. So, but exec ed is fantastic. It's something I kind of recommend people maybe do a little bit later in their career, because again, it can be a little time consuming prepping it. But it does provide a nice additional research stream, because you meet all these executives and sometimes they follow up with you and you can get conversations going about stuff. And then at that point you can think about research projects with the executives that are in the classroom. I've done that. When I wrote my first book, practitioner book, in 2017, I used my executive education participants a lot as sources of interviews and conversations and finding examples for the book. So yeah, I think that's all available. And I've got colleagues that do consulting and don't do exec ed. So mine is just one model. So I wouldn't just rule it out altogether. Someone said the article I was rejected on the most has my highest ever altmetric score. That is not unusual. I've had articles that were rejected. In fact, the review piece in JIBS was rejected somewhere else, qualitative review piece, and now it's my most cited or second to highest most cited article in my career.
It is on the reading list, so the students read it.
That's great.
And yeah. That
was rejected from Journal of Management, and I remember the editor, because you never forget your rejections, do you? Not that I'm bitter. But they wanted us to turn it into a theory paper with propositions, and I'm like, it's a review. It's not a theory paper. We're gonna talk about theory in the paper, but it's really a review piece, not a theory piece. So it's always nice when, the best revenge is success. So when that article comes out and it's super highly cited, you can always say, yeah, that's the one you rejected. I wouldn't say that to them. Somebody did say that to me, actually. As an AE at AMJ, they're like, you remember that paper you rejected, blah, blah, blah? And I'm like, vaguely. And they're like, yeah, I got accepted it. I'm like, oh, good. I didn't want a best paper award. So yes, it happens. Not unusual for that to happen. So
I just did a quick count and I see there are 9 papers that you are a co-author of on the reading list for this course.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Some of them are the ones that we did together, but then obviously many of yours, including the Kirkman, Lowe, and Gibson 2006 JIBS. Yeah.
Yes, and that one actually won the JIBS Decade Award, which is they wait 10 years and they look at every article that was published in the 2006 volume. A committee is put together to decide which one of those articles, I guess there were 80, probably 70 or 80, would be the one that had the most impact. And we were very delighted that JIBS recognized that paper. So even better. Somebody does say exec ed comp is limited to a max of 30%. Heather said that. That's the same at NC State. You can get exceptions. You can get waivers from the dean. And a lot of times they're approved. But yeah, you do have to watch out for some of that. And overload teaching, I think, is the same. I think all that counts. And so you have to watch out. I think ours is 33%, the 33% rule.
Yeah.
Susan wants to know tips for selecting co-authors. Mine has always been people I like and that I want to spend a lot of time with and that I want to work with. And they're also smart, thank goodness, and smarter than me. So I always pick co-authors that are smarter than I am. That's not that hard. And then people that I really, really, really want to spend time with, because when you work on these papers, you do interact quite a bit. And so the ability to have fun, working on research, doing data collection with your friends. I remember traveling all over the country with people that were my co-authors, and we went to different cities and collected data, and we would hang out at night, and it's great. So this is a hard job, and it takes a lot of effort to do it. And you might as well do it with people that you like and that you enjoy their company, and people that are complementary to you, right? So putting together teams of people who aren't just all alike, right? They're bringing different skill sets to the table. Then when you bring all those different skill sets together, you've got a really great team.
Yeah, if you are the smartest guy in the room, you are in a wrong room.
Yeah, I agree with that.
In the decades, there's the JIPS 2006. By the way, incidentally, with Kevin Lowe, who was also for a long time a professor at UNCG and the department head who actually hired me. So now he's in Australia. And also, noticeably, Brad said that JIPS, or international business, used to be more strategy. But if you look at the JIPS Best Article Awards of the last year, there are actually more and more micro level. So 2006, so 16 would be Brad's article, which is all about basically international culture in IB. But then this year, for example, that's Stahl and Marta Matsnevsky, who was mentioned earlier. It's a meta-analysis on diversity in teams. Then 3 years ago, it was David Ralston with cultural convergence, cross-vergence. It's on your reading list. So which is also more kind of microcultural change. So now it seems to be at least half of them are more kind of on people in international business and not so much. I mean, there are still enough on firms and mergers and acquisitions, but micro IB, OB in IB is gaining some traction and recognition.
Yeah, it's funny. All the macro scholars think that AMJ is all micro, and all the micro people think AMJ is all macro. And we've done the analysis multiple times, and it's exactly 50-50. It's right down the middle. So yeah, that's Mark says he's currently not involved with the university, right? But looking to transition. I think having been in industry and having practical experience can really be a plus when transitioning back into academia. NC State, it's a pretty young business school. The Poole College has only been around since 1992. They tended for years to hire people with a lot of industry experience plus the PhD. They didn't seek out people who, like me, kind of went right through, worked a little bit, but had nowhere near like a decade or that work experience. And I think the reason NC State did that is because we're really involved in practical, they call them practicum or practica projects, where we pair our students up with businesses in the triangle. Instead of working on a case or writing a paper on a subject, you actually physically get to work with companies and solve real world problems. So I think part of NC State's hiring plan was to get people who could run those projects. And they felt like people who had industry experience could speak the language with the companies and be good facilitators and coaches of those projects. So I think it can be a positive in terms of bringing that experience into academia, because you kind of bring the best of both worlds. So if you're interested in talking more about that, I can talk with you more about that offline as well.
Yeah.
I have a question that's kind of hard to type out because it's a little wordy. given the current environment that we're in right now, I wonder, especially in your role as an editor, how or what is the current thought on looking at bias in the kind of international scholarship that's being done? Because some of the things I'm researching, reading right now are about the roots of the management strategy we teach is actually in Western colonialism. And when we look at these global teams, we may be really missing something in a different perspective that is viewed as, you know, other or not as good, but maybe it is.
Yeah, I think I think the West has been pretty dominant in terms of the production of management and business research and even IB. I think, fortunately, I think we're seeing a shift to some extent, not completely, but a shift in terms of making sure that we're capturing things that are more, I guess we call it emic in nature, not so etic, right? What are the cultural specifics as opposed to doing another study on transformational leadership in 30 countries. It's like, yeah, but that's a West anyway. Yeah. So, and we're seeing it even, I think in editorial boards, like when I look at AMJ's editorial board or AMR, you see much more diversity in terms of not only country, but also discipline. So it doesn't look so, I mean, 20, 30 years ago, people were kind of all trained the same way, pretty much in the same area, and that formed the board of these journals. The editorial boards and the associate editor teams. And so very little that was outside that tradition was able to get in. But now I think we're seeing a much more diverse approach to making sure that we hear all voices when it comes to research and scholarship. So I think things are changing in that perspective. But it's a fact that the dominance of the sort of Western, set of constructs and approaches and methods really had been around for decades. And there's been, fortunately, a lot of pushback against that, and things are starting to change from that perspective.
All right, well, thank you so much. There is a comment also from Catherine, who was an undergraduate student at NC State and was working in one of those practicum projects. So
was it Leaf? Must have been Leaf. Leaf owns seemingly every car dealership in all of Raleigh. You can't drive down the street without bumping into a Leaf dealership. So it's probably one of theirs, I'm guessing. Yeah. But that's great. You have that experience because I think that's what NC State's known for. When you bring colleagues in from other universities around the country and you start showing them everything that we're doing and all this practical engagement with companies, they can't believe it. They just can't believe that we have that. And we just got reaccredited as a business school through our accrediting agency is AACSB. And one of the things the review team said more than once is they cannot believe the amount of engagement that the business school has with the business community. It's very, very interdependent with the actual businesses and all these projects that are going on now. So I think that's true. I didn't come from business schools that had that. Texas A&M, very traditional. Georgia Tech, maybe a little bit more of that. So I'm a little bit of a fish out of water at NC State because I wasn't brought up in a tradition of all these practical cases. We did cases like Harvard cases, right? Fictional or based on real events. That's what I was trained to do. So when I came here, it was like pretty impressive that we're able to do that. And the students love it. I mean, what better training can you have than actually working with real companies solving real problems? You're not just reading about a company and talk about it in class. It also helps them on the job market because they can talk about all those projects they did with real companies too. So we have a pretty good success rate at placing our students as well.
If you want to learn how to swim, you have to get in the water, and it's the same with business. Yeah.
Yep.
Is that at the undergrad level? You have all of these as well?
Both.
All right.
Yeah, both levels. And every year, near the end of the semester, and in the spring, in April, we have what's called Leadership Showcase, where students bring the projects they've been working on the past year. And I think in the last year, when we could get together physically, we set them up in the basketball arena, the smaller one. I'm sorry, I went to UNC for 8 years, so I'm bad. Reynolds Coliseum at NC State. And it's like they can create posters and they do pitches talking about what problems they solve with the company. We have an award ceremony, best project. People vote. We bring in the local business community and they judge the projects. And so when you get to see, there's lots of undergraduate teams and lots of graduate teams. And when you see all of it lined up in one space, 30, 40, 50 teams, it's remarkable. It really is.
All right, well, thank you so much, Brad. Very informative. A quick update for you, not related to the talk, but to research. So we met yesterday with Pierce and Charles from New York about the free rider paper. So you remember Pierce found like 2,000 papers. And
Yeah.
so we needed to download them and code them. And luckily for us, one of the culture professors in New York got 8 teaching assistants for the summer and nothing for them to do. And so he called me and said, any help you need around culture? And I thought, well, there is this study, maybe you can help. So now we basically dumped all that list of references on them. They're now downloading full text articles. They have access to all the databases. And then hopefully we'll be able to also go through them, see which ones contain data and do the coding. Then we will rerun the analysis and then back to the paper so that hopefully we will be able to resubmit it sometime soon.
That's
So
great. That's great.
as we speak, so literally.
That's awesome. And I will send you those slides, Vas, right now that I use at the
yeah.
Academy. And you can feel free to distribute them. And if anybody has any questions as you're going through the slides, you can just reach out to me through email.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you,
My
Brad.
pleasure, guys. My pleasure. Take
Super
care.
helpful.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
All right.
Thank you.
So, thank you. And then let's talk a little bit about the course business. So one, I have your ratings of your ideas. I'll share that right after the lecture. So again, as you're selecting the best idea for your term paper, but hopefully one that will become a publication later on and possibly your dissertation, depending on what you want to do. So I'll have those kind of group ratings in case you want to see which ideas were more popular. And so for this week, then your job will be to select one of them, maybe describe it in a little bit more detail, but yeah, the goal is to always make a little progress here. So again, I've seen, basically read carefully the full list, and my challenge was that I can clearly see how any of those ideas that you proposed can be developed in a good publishable paper. And so the challenge I would have is not so much, what do I do? But the question is, which of the many ideas do I choose? And again, some of them require a little bit more work, some require less work. Like for some of them, I can clearly see how it can be done in a few months, data collection and then write up. Others, a brilliant idea, but it will be much more difficult to collect the data. And so if I were doing the selection, making the selections, it would be the question, do I want it to be some sort of a quick publication, or do I want to build my whole career around it? And so some of those ideas literally will take, years and years to fully develop and will lead to multiple publications. So, but pretty much all of them are viable ideas as far as, yes, they can be developed with some extra work, into publications. So I'm not even sure how to recommend, like what to recommend you as to which ones you choose. If any of you came to me with the 3 and said, which one should I take? You will have the ratings from people in terms of which ones they find interesting. But then again, should we go after the most interesting ones, or should we go after the most publishable ones, or the easiest one to publish or quickly to complete? So that's a tough question. So I guess the question almost becomes, do you just want to have a quick publication, or do you want to develop it into a research stream? Because some of them will be a stream with multiple publications coming out of it. Like for example, with Brad, we started working together, must have been like 12 years ago. That's before I came to UNCG. And so the way it worked was with Pierce, we're doing a meta-analysis on cultural values. And that was right after, like a year late after Brad published the GIPS paper. And so we thought that maybe we should invite him as a co-author because he just published that review, and ours was a meta-analytic review, which is kind of not unlike the review that they did, but based on a different type of data. And so what we did was we decided to sort of meet Brad and see how he is, and then decide if we want to work with him. And so we went to one of his presentations at a conference, I think it was Academy of Management, watched the presentation, and then stayed after the presentation to talk to him. He was popular, a bunch of people were asking questions, but then, we came, and he immediately saw the potential in that paper. And so we teamed up and started working on that paper. And since then, we've published at least a dozen papers together. Most of them are still meta-analysis. So it's still sort of, echoes of that first original paper. So we had first meta-analysis looking at What Culture Predicts. It was published in Journal of Applied Psychology and even got the status of a monograph, like a big deal, something they do like once in 10 years. But then we had another one and another one and another one and still working on another one. So those kinds of things, you know, if you do it sort of right, it leads to a stream of research, not just one publication. Any comments, questions about either the presenter or general stuff before we get to the literature? Then when it comes to the literature, so I don't want to spend too much time because it's one of these topics where on the one hand, we can talk about it all day and not cover it. On the other hand, you know, you have the reading, so what's the point of talking about it? So I'll just give you a quick overview of the reading so you sort of know what to pay attention to, if you can see my screen here, and just a general idea. So one, this week we are dealing with micro-OB, so basically what Brad was talking about. So international HR-OB, industrial organizational psychology, those are all very closely related. And so we have here first a few essentially review papers. So you have a bunch of reviews of this field in general, and so papers that introduce you to the field. Of note, Michelle Gelfand will be our guest speaker in a week. And so she's interested not only as a researcher in this area, and she will be talking about that, but also she may be the last one to come up with an original theory of culture. Because once Hofstadter came up with his theory, there were literally dozens and dozens of sort of replications, refinements. Her cultural looseness tightness theory is a sort of fundamentally new look at the issue. So also she's interested in that she's moving now in the process of moving from University of Maryland to Stanford. And so again, in our field, international cross-cultural, as I said, most of the people, like best schools are not those big name schools. And so Michelle is a little unique in that respect. She's positioning herself as a psychologist. And so she's moving into a psychology department, but she's doing cross-cultural psychology. So, but anyway, we have several reviews here that I strongly recommend that you read. If nothing else, read these reviews just to get a general big picture. So, but then again, to be true to the ID focus of this course, I did not include any readings that are general HR-OB. And as Brad pointed out, you know, many of us sort of are kind of general HR-OB and just add a little flavor to it and say that we are cross-cultural HR-OB. But in reality, we still do general HR-OB research just in the international context. So when it comes to teams, for example, you know, if you think about conflicts or if you think about communication or leadership, it would be the same theories for the domestic teams as they would be for the international teams. And so because you have a separate head or separate course on international HR-OB, I thought most of those theories are already covered, so there is no point in covering them. But there are some things that are specifically sort of international. And so one of them would be cross-cultural teams. And in most cases, when we say cross-cultural these days, we mean global virtual teams. And so I selected a few readings here that specifically deal with global teams. Again, with the stars, those are primarily reviews that talk a little bit more about the big picture, just to give you the introduction. But then also there are some more specialized, you know, like looking at a specific topic. Like for example, our friend here and co-author, Stacy Fitzsimmons, she does a lot of research on what she calls multiculturals or biculturals, originally called. So just to give you a flavor of what those you know, types of research topics are. And again, once you talk about multicultural employees, you know, people whose parents maybe came from different countries, or someone who grew up in multiple countries, or someone who may be an expatriate. So that sort of becomes fundamentally international business. So I mean, it does not exist outside that international dimension. And so here you have a few studies to get a sense of what that is. But then again, if any of you are interested more in the topic, there is a lengthy list of additional readings that may be very useful in this context. And again, I tried to select a paper or two for each of the sort of functional areas related to teams. So something on leadership, something on conflict, something on justice, perceptions of justice, those kinds of things. So some of them are involved with, others are by other authors, but it should give you a good sense of, you know, the general theories and concepts and, you know, data. Yeah.
Boss,
Yeah.
so did you say, I just want to make sure I understand this correctly. So if we're dealing with And because this word culture, I kind of struggle with. I've always thought of it as not just national. You know, I don't think of it as just national. So, but I'm wondering if, where I live, for example, in California, is very diverse. The biggest city in our county is over 50% Hispanic and predominantly Mexican immigrants. And so if I did a study there with that population, that would be considered international?
This is an excellent, excellent question. And in fact, one of the papers we published with Brad, the speaker today, is called Culture Does Not Equal Country. And
Right.
the column in search of better containers for culture or something like that. And so the main point of that paper was a meta-analysis, by the way, again, sort of a consequence of that first paper that we did. The main point there was that when we say culture, traditionally people think country, you know, like a German culture, American culture, you know, Japanese culture, Canadian culture, and so on. The truth is that no matter how you define culture, not only in Hofstadian, you know, sense, but also, you know, if you talk about culture, the way people talk or dress or greet each other, it will never, or it usually does not follow the kind of national borderlines. One, you will sometimes see clusters of countries, you know, multiple countries that essentially have the same culture. And so it will not be that different. Like if you go like Germany, Austria, for example, maybe parts of Italy, I mean, for all senses and purposes, it will be a similar culture, you know, the way people dress, the way people, you know, read each other, the way they collaborate, the standards, they're not really that different, even though they may even be, you know, speaking different languages. At the same time, when you look at some cultures, countries, you will see multiple cultures within the country. And it's, you know, the United States is a wonderful example. There have been several books, like there is one called 9 Cultures of the United States, for example. And they talk about, you know, regional differences. And yes, you're absolutely right. California is as different from, for example, Texas or Nebraska, probably more different than, you know, than Czech Republic is different from Germany. And so not only, I mean, the language is sort of the same English, but even language, you know, the or proportion of people who speak, for example, Spanish or some other languages for that matter too, you know, is very, very different. But also the slang, you know, like so differences between some American sort of languages are more different than between, for example, German and Austrian versions of German. So, so therefore, yes, I think that would totally qualify. And so you have several things that are sort of, you know, bona fide international, like when you say, you know, Hispanic population, I mean, in a sense, most of them are first generation immigrants. And right there, you have a connection to other countries, you know, Mexico, further south. But also, if you want to talk about it as culture, you know, per se, so even if people are from there, like California is especially interesting. You have like very, very distinct cultures. You have the Silicon Valley, like that's a whole different world. And then you have Southern California, which is very different. And you have, you know, like some farming communities, you have high tech, you have. So I think literally when you look at California, not only in terms of the economy size and population size, it's, you know, basically if it were an independent country, it would be what, like 6th, 7th in the world, but also cultural diversity, it's unprecedented. I mean, it's such a concentration. So I think it totally would be qualifiable to be published in IB journals, and I don't see a problem with that. But also related to that is you don't have to publish it necessarily in IB. AMJ, JAP, like all of those general management journals, they always publish international research as well. And so especially if it's something that it's kind of not clear, is it really international? Is it just multicultural? Is it domestic? So I wouldn't worry too much about it. Go for the topic. I'm sure there will be journals where you can publish it. So no problem at all.
Thanks.
If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let me get back to my reading list. So as I said, you have here a selection of topics. It's not a perhaps comprehensive list, but I tried to select articles that give you a sense of the topics discussed in the context of cross-cultural teams. And so it will give you a good kind of overview, like a sampler platter. But also they tend to be like the articles on this list are the ones that led to some, you know, either seminal, you know, cited a lot, or maybe used a theory that is very popular. So it should give you a good idea. And again, if you find this topic interesting, I recommend you to look at all of them, or at the very least, you know, keep this list, because one day you may need it when the time comes to, you know, cite something. So cross-cultural training, I added one, a review that I just published recently, specifically that looks at the history of cross-cultural training. And so this one does not necessarily talk about theories of cross-cultural training, although we do have something there, related to theories. But the good thing is that it provides you kind of like an overview of how cross-cultural training has been seen and done over the last 100 years or so. And so again, it may be a useful study if you wanted to do something on, cross-cultural training, executive education, maybe expatriate training, or for that matter, assessment of effectiveness of these interventions. Because what happens in many cases, I actually do, not a lot, but at least once a year, sometimes twice, so have done maybe 20, 30, 40 over my career, consulting sessions, let's call it, where a company would call me to do some sort of training for their employees. In some cases, it would be, they would have an international team, like there is this company, Jacobs Electronics, they install equipment at factories. And so when they do that, they bring engineers from all around the world, and they live for a couple of months at the site and basically wire the whole factory. And so they would invite me often before the team starts working together, so that we can, make a team out of them before they start working together. And so one thing that drives me, not crazy, but, surprises me, is that I say, and I can evaluate if it makes a difference. Maybe we can do some controlled experiment, or at the very, least do some sort of a pre and post survey and see if what what I do here for you, if it helps. You're investing all that money. Don't you want to know by how much, the number of conflicts goes down, or the productivity goes up, or motivation, or whatever. And to my surprise, they never want to do that. Like all the companies, it's almost as if they're afraid to see the results. And I'm not sure if they're afraid the results will not be so good, or if they will be too good, they will need to pay me more. Or I don't know why they wouldn't hire maybe a third party, raters who will evaluate, because you want to know how many dollars you get for every dollar you invest. And somehow, I'm not sure if it's secretive or something else, but they, at most what they do at most companies, there would be like a smiley face survey at the end. How much did you like the training? But there is a big difference between, having fun during the training and actually making a difference, when they come to work on Monday. And so one of the problems also with that is that it kind of gives me false incentives. So when I know that I will not be evaluated on the productivity improvements, but rather how happy the employees are, it creates an incentive to play more games and, do some fun things. But again, all those games are not necessarily going to be very effective, in the real workplace. So sort of, but also I cannot really do something more sophisticated, because it may not be as much fun, but if they don't do the survey of productivity improvements, how do you prove that it was effective? Same issue, by the way, with, college professors, like when you teach, for example, any subject, like for example, math or statistics or international business. So we are evaluated by how much fun you had in the course. And in a sense, it's my job to entertain you. But if my goal was to make sure that you know how to calculate, some equations, formulas, stuff like that, maybe it should be much stricter, and maybe it should be more drilling and more, but then it will be no fun, and you will give me low teaching evaluations. So kind of becomes a little, double-edged, sword here. And so in the readings, I included some review related to cross-cultural training and effectiveness of training evaluations, in case this is what you want to do. Then this one is kind of getting into diversity, again, kind of blurs the lines between international and domestic, because a lot of research is done on the diversity in the domestic context. It could be gender diversity, it could be age, it could be, political, religious, sexual orientation, all kinds of things that, that make us different. And there is enough of that going on in the domestic context, and obviously much of research doesn't have anything to do with cultural differences or national differences. But the theories are the same, and so I included a few articles here that are sort of more domestic context and a few that are more international context. And much of this research sort of revolves around this notion of fault lines, us versus them. And so many studies have shown that when you have, everybody is the same, everybody's happy. Everybody is different, you have 7 people and 7 people from 7 different countries, sort of kind of also is fine. But when you have like 3 on 3, that's where things become a little bit, tricky. So us versus them, old versus young, Germans versus Americans, Republicans versus Democrats increasingly. I still remember the time when I came to the United States for the first time in 1999. There were 2 parties, but people were sort of okay. Now, literally on my street, I have some of my neighbors that don't talk to one another because of politics. Who would have thought? But, that's a very, very strong kind of fault line all of a sudden. So here are some of the studies that you might want to read, including, for example, the one that I mentioned, the GIBS Best Paper Decade Award of this year. So this paper is considered, is got the Best Paper of the Decade Award this year, and published 10 years ago. So it's a very nice theoretical piece. And then a couple of things that I also did on the topic. Yes, go ahead.
I just have a quick question about fault lines.
Yeah.
I was reading a few papers last semester and became very interested in fault lines. It was something that I just had like a real basic knowledge of. But I wonder, can you really apply that toward global virtual teams, or are fault lines something that we recognize in each other when we're working more in face-to-face environment? Curious.
Two very important questions that you raised. Very, very interesting questions. So one, can you, yes, you can, in a sense that many people have done it. So I'm not saying that it's necessarily the best way to do it, but many people have done it. In fact, one paper that we are finishing up as we speak with Justin and Mariana, you know them, deals with temporal asymmetries, as they call it in teams. So basically differences in time zones and differences in chronotypes. So we're kind of merging two bodies of literature into one theory. So there is theory by general management that deals with what they call chronotype differences, and that's larks, doves, and owls. Some people are most productive in the morning, some people are productive at noon, and some people are productive, late at night. And so they have this whole body of research of how it is important to have that what they call temporal symmetry or synchrony. And if some people are, if people are active at different times of the day, then obviously that's, presenting problems. And so they talk a lot about these fault lines. They say how, in fact, apparently show with the data, how sometimes you would literally have like larks versus, owls. They don't communicate because one group is sleepy in the morning, the other is sleepy at night and stuff like that. But then you have this whole other body of research on time zone separation. And again, there are several papers that specifically talk about that as being, a fault line. So if some of us are in Europe and some of us are in the United States, we tend to communicate more with people in our time zone, and that creates all kinds of problems, and then, leads to, essentially fault lines lead to conflicts, us versus them, or not understanding each other. And so there is enough research that talks about that, for example, in global virtual teams as not only culture, like Germans versus Americans, but also, time zone. And so apparently there are enough separations here going on. Also in the papers on diversity that we did, we looked at all kinds of diversities, specifically in global virtual teams, the one that we just published in Journal of International Management, for example. And so perceptions seem to be extremely important. So it's not even real cultural differences, but perceptions of us versus them, how different we find each other's culture. And so apparently, again, people from, let's say, rich countries tend to group together, and people from poor countries tend to group together. And so even though it's global virtual teams, it's still visible. But the second point that you pointed out is that there is apparently research that shows that in global virtual teams, some of these visible markers of diversity are not as visible. And so in face-to-face teams, research shows that people tend to be sort of more divisive when it comes to like age or gender, or race for that matter, because you see that right away. Whereas in global virtual teams, I guess it's changing now with all the Zooms and Skypes, but still to a large extent, we rely on email. And in email, we don't see how old you are, how, the color of your skin, the religious affiliation you have. And so some of those things become sort of irrelevant. And so it's a little bit more about merit. Is it wishful thinking? I don't know. I mean, so there is research that says that, yes, in global virtual teams, some of those biases are not as strong. But yeah, so it could be that in global virtual teams, fault lines, there are fewer opportunities for fault lines, at least based on the, how we look and how we talk. You obviously have, as I said, by default, essentially you have the time involved in that. You have the national differences, culture, economy. So, but yeah. So again, you can literally write a whole, not only book, a career around this topic. So very interesting. So,
thank you.
What's your experience with that, Karen? I mean, do you think that global virtual teams have fewer problems with biases, fault lines?
I would just have my own experiences, not really looking at the research, but I do hear what you're saying. I think that time zones have a larger influence than people give credit for. I even see it with the Academy of International Business meetings, right, that we're doing for the workshop this week. time zones are still, always just an obstacle for people. This morning, some people are grumbling because they're on a workshop at 7 o'clock in the morning Eastern Standard Time. Other people is 2 o'clock in New Zealand in the morning. So it does create difficulties. But yeah, it's a curious conversation about fault lines. I'd like to think that perhaps because people are maybe engaged, I think it's all about the motivation of why you're on that global virtual team. It has a lot to do with how well you adapt and how severe the fault lines might be. And then again, some of the time zone differences are sort of, perfectly fine for collaboration. Like, for example, we have a lot of collaborators in Europe, and usually my comfortable morning and their comfortable afternoon works for us just fine. But then you remember, Karen, last semester we worked with Gordon from Singapore. So we had a class of students in Singapore, and it was an exactly 12-hour difference. And so when you have exactly 12 hours, it was almost impossible to find a good time. So some of the meetings we had, we would start like at 9 p.m. and stay almost till midnight, because for them it would be 9 a.m. till noon. But it was like, it's just not easy to find a good time, when you have that sort of separation in time. So, but yeah, I guess it is what it is. So, all right, so you have some of that. And then again, even though communication in general is a kind of general topic, so it's general management, general communication theory, but once you get into cross-cultural context, some things become a little different. First of all, it would be in many cases technology-mediated communication, so sort of virtual teams, most of them, or many of them become international, but also you have this whole cultural layer of, different communication styles, directness, context, importance, media richness. And so I included a few studies just to give you an example of those kinds of studies and theories. Expatriation, we don't have to talk about that, so I included a bunch of interesting theories. So I'm extremely happy that Anwil Harting agreed to be one of our guest speakers. And that one, I was so excited about it that I decided to do it as a separate event. And so we will be inviting basically the whole IB community to attend, in fact, management community, not just IB community. We will be inviting to that talk because I thought it would be too little if we just did it as part of the class. And so what's interesting about Anwil is that years ago, she'll tell you more about that, but years ago, at that time, she was in Australia. She was applying for promotion, and she noticed that some of her most cited papers were actually book chapters. And she felt if she went by sort of the journal caliber, she will not be able to get the tenure because she didn't have many of those top journal publications, but she had some publications that at that time already were sort of making big waves and becoming really, really widely recognized as seminal work. And so as a way to prove to her superiors that she's done good research, she started compiling the list of journals with all kinds of statistics on them. And that led to this Harting Journal Quality List. If you haven't done, or if you haven't found it, quality list. She has a website. As I said, it's become almost like the second website for the Academy of International Business. So people go there, probably, the visitations are probably as high as for the AAB's website. But here, what you can find is, you can find this journal quality list. You have a list by some, so it's like 50 revisions by now. I don't even know, like, as you can see, it's a lot of revisions. And so where do we download it now? To download, where's the download now? Used to be a link, frequently asked questions. Yes, here it is. So you can go by title and you can go by the subject area. And so if you open by the subject area, as I usually do, so you have, as I said, you have all of these editions, but then you have pretty much all of the journals related in one way or another to management, with every single ranking of those journals on every single list. So if you go to, like, for example, let's take, I don't know, IB. Let's go to IB. Whereas international business, general management, marketing, did I skip IB? Oh, IB here. And so you have all kinds of journals, like International Studies of Management and Organization. And so, 2 from 4 to 1 scale on this rating scale, 2 from 4 to 1 scale on this rating scale, A from A to A plus to A minus on this list. And so not ranked by this one. So you get kind of full dossier on that journal, how it ranks in every possible ranking system.
And if it has a star here, that's the current FT50 Financial Times 50 journal, International Journal of International Business Studies. It's a, the only thing that I wish they added, and I'm not sure if it's a copyright issue, but impact factor. So I'm not sure why there is no impact factor here, but I know that Web of Science is extremely sensitive about those things. Like you cannot just download them, without a subscription, and probably that's a legal issue. That's something we can ask her during the presentation. But as you see, like 4 out of 4 on this stars, 4 stars out of 4 here. I'm not sure why it's not A+, because now, as I said, it has the highest impact factor of all management journals. And so I'm not sure why it's not A star, A+ here, but it is what it is. And so it's a very useful resource. And so she was the one who encouraged me to compile the catalogs of the instruments for measuring culture and acculturation, because she said that this catalog here gave her more recognition and more mileage than the publications in the traditional journals. And the same thing is with me with my catalogs. I mean, I never published them as books, but quite a few libraries actually called me and said, can we publish it, add it as a book to our collection? So who would have thought? But anyway, so there are a few papers by her on the reading list, and also we will talk more about the publishing game with her, because as I said, she's doing this journal quality list, and then also there is an accompanying app, like an application called Publisher Parish. And so it's kind of powered by Google Scholar or type of Google Scholar, but it does much more, and I use it all the time for meta-analysis. A very useful resource, and she even wrote a book around that app, and then it's essentially as important for some researchers as PSS or R or Stata or whatever you use. So great stuff here. So again, a bunch of articles, including by Ann Will on expatriation. And then obviously negotiations, again, is not really an international topic per se, but there are some special circumstances related to negotiations and conflict resolution in international context. And so we have a bunch of readings on the topics. Again, some of the theories are universally applied regardless of the context, but I was trying to select specifically ones that deal with international context. And same thing with leadership. As Brad was saying, that you have this emic and etic approach. If you don't know what that is, very important for theory. So the etic approach, the term means or assumes that there are some universal, what's the word, like dimensions that apply in all contexts. So when we talk about, for example, individualism, collectivism, we assume that you can measure individualism and collectivism in any culture. The difference will be in the degree to which we are individualist, collectivist. But the concept is basically the same. Others say that there are some things, and perhaps most of them, that are sort of etic in the nature, meaning that the concept does not exist outside that specific culture. And so usually as an example, they take this Chinese guanxi, so which is a purely Chinese thing that is distinct from American social capital or Russian blood or whatever, other similar constructs are. And you can't really measure nations on guanxi because it just doesn't apply to other contexts. So you cannot say that China is high on guanxi and the United States is low on it. It just doesn't apply outside China, or at least it will not exist in that same format. And so when it comes to global leadership, that's definitely the case. So, we have models and theories of leadership, like directive and cooperative and, mediation, and, you have all of those models, but some of them just simply don't exist in some cultures. You cannot really call it, high or low. It just doesn't exist. And there are some other structures in place that don't exist in the United States. And so you have to study them almost as case studies and not as a dimension, where you can place the countries or people on a kind of low, high dimension. So I, again, selected a few studies that I thought would be helpful here. But yeah, that's the plan for this week. And I trust that you've read some of those articles. And as I said, you don't have to read all of them, read the ones that you like, but keep the list because there will be a day when you will need it. And so in that case, you don't have to frantically go through Google Scholar and trying to find the studies that you need, because you will have many more than you can read, and it will be hard to select the ones that you need. And so it becomes basically just overwhelming and hard to work through. All right, so I think I've covered everything I was planning to. So I'm not sure if you have any specific questions either about any of the papers or theories or about the course in general, but that's all I planned for today. Okay, then let's stop here. So as always, if you have any questions or comments, just reach out directly to me. I'll be happy to respond. And let's see how things go this week, and then I'll see you next week.
You're going to
Yeah,
You're going to send out the ratings, the results? of
Yeah,
the-
yeah, so I'll share that within the next 30 minutes or so.
excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.